that, Adam, like, we get a question a lot about recession and if all this is going to push us into a recession. Maybe hit on that a little bit, whether you guys see that in the future or on the horizon, and your view on that.
Right. So the first thing that happened when the tariffs came in, if everybody knows, there's this concept called GDP, which is the total goods and services made by the U.S., which some bean counter in Washington attempts to very imperfectly measure on a quarterly basis. It's messy, as you can imagine. You can't really count most of the transactions at the kind of level that they want to ever adequately measure it, but it's a good general guide. And then there's the one of the feds actually produces what's called GDP Now, which is a daily indicator of where they think GDP is going. Like they're actually skeptical of the government numbers, so they print their own kind of daily monitor. And like anything, that is also a model that's based on some inputs that they've calibrated and they've used historic precedent. And one of the things that they used as a leading indicator, if you haven't seen the chart on this, it's pretty shocking how much it moved, but they moved it from being going from a growth economy to a negative growth economy in like 2 weeks back when the tariffs were announced, and everyone panicked, and you looked and you said, well, what was going on? And the signal that they were using and over extrapolating was gold coming back to the US, which was it was mechanistically part of the tariffs, but usually that's seen as a flight to quality. In this case, that was people avoiding a tax, so just engaging in the good old American thing of dodging unnecessary taxes. But it set off a kind of a thing that then quickly reversed itself. When you look at the ensemble of economic data, what we can see so far is that inflation is not coming down as quickly as the Fed would like to warrant a lot more rate increases. And Jay Powell said as much as we're recording this when he spoke to, after the FOMC meeting yesterday. He said maybe we're looking at 1 or 2 cuts at most, inflation being somewhere in the 2.5 to 3.5% category. And we're seeing the economic data has softened a little bit coming into the beginning of 2025. That is a long way from saying that we're either going to have the good old-fashioned traditional 2008, 2016, 2020 style of recession. The idea of having 2% GDP growth with 2 to 3% inflation is a pretty healthy economy. And so what we would say when we look at a recession is that we would have to see a lot of things go badly from here on a lot of fronts before we would take any of the economic indicators that we're seeing and say that they're much more than having 1 or 2 go a little bit sideways being noise. And on the other side, the thing that we're really afraid of, if you've heard this word stagflation is the idea of economic stagnation at the same time that we have inflation. So it becomes the worst kind of recession. This is what we dealt with in the 1970s. And if you remember in 2022, this was the big fear. There's very little indication that even if inflation from here stays at 2.5 to 3.5%, that we're going to go back to an environment. We think where inflation gets to be too high, it's up in like the 4s and 5%, and having that stay there, which is what we started, if we look at 2022, that's what we were starting to see as a distinct possibility. The Fed doesn't foresee that. And right now with economic growth slowing a little bit, I would argue that worst case scenario is actually off the table. And since the Fed is actually talking about cutting rates, trust me, if they believe that inflation was going to get out of control, that'd be the first thing they would take off the table to kind of alarm people. And they would start talking about using their other mechanisms to buy long-term bonds to keep the long-term rate of interest down. They're doing none of those things, which indicates that for us, that worst kind of recession is not something that they're even that worried about. And then the traditional one, there's very little evidence of it. And we have a healthy yield curve, we have a healthy economy. So I get that it's scary, and I know that markets do what they've just done 2 or 3 times a year, and we don't remember that at the end of the year. We don't remember, by the way, even last August, how scary it was. I was doing calls like this, and I blocked it out of my mind because it was so short-lived, and then I think economic data and reasonability kind of came through, and my suspicion is that's where we'll get to right now.